Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where President Trump is preparing for his high-stakes meeting with Russian President Putin on Friday, virtually huddling with European leaders and President Zelensky this morning amid their concerns that the pair could strike a unilateral deal without Ukraine at the table. The leader-level summit with Putin, which the White House says will take place at a U.S. military base in Anchorage, Alaska, will be their first in-person meeting since 2019 and the first time in 10 years since Putin steps foot on U.S. soil. President Trump spoke to reporters today during an event at the Kennedy Center about his call with Zelensky and his expectations for Friday's summit. He also delivered a warning to Russia.
We had a very good call. He was on the call. President Zelensky was on the call. I would rate it a 10, very, very friendly. Certain great things can be gained in the first. It's going to be a very important meeting, but it's setting the table for the second meeting. I think the second meeting, if the second meeting takes place, now there may be no second meeting because if I feel that it's not appropriate to have it because I didn't get the answers that we have to have, then we're not going to have a second meeting.
Russia face any consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to stop the war after your meeting on Friday?
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will the consequences
There will be
be?
consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences.
Now, President Trump also appeared to downplay hopes of any real lasting breakthroughs from Friday's meeting, giving the notorious difficulties of taking Vladimir Putin at his word.
When you meet with Vladimir Putin Friday in Alaska,
do
you believe you can convince him to stop targeting civilians in Ukraine?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've had that conversation with him. I've had a lot of good conversations with him. Then I go home and I see that a rocket hit a nursing home or a rocket hit an apartment building and people are laying dead in the streets. So I guess the answer to that is no.
Meanwhile, President Zelensky, speaking alongside the German chancellor in Berlin, said he warned President Trump that Putin is bluffing, both trying to portray Russia as capable of occupying all of Ukraine and trying to act as if the sanctions are not hurting Russia's economy. Zelensky added that he believes everything that concerns Ukraine should be discussed with Ukraine and is prepared for trilateral talks with President Trump and President Putin if they happen. The Trump-Putin summit also comes as the New York Times is reporting that investigators have uncovered evidence that Russia is partially responsible for a recent hack of a federal court's filing system, including highly sensitive records that could reveal sources and people charged with national security crimes. NBC News has not independently confirmed the New York Times reporting. President Trump said today that he was not surprised by the story, given Russia's history of hacking. Joining me now is White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and NBC News chief Washington correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell. All right, Yamiche, let's start with you. What more can we expect from this meeting on Friday with President Putin? What kind of expectations setting are you hearing from White House officials?
Well, it's a good question. The president really is lowering expectations here. The president saying essentially that this is a feel Putin out kind of meeting, that he's going to sit down, look Vladimir Putin in his face and make a determination on whether or not he feels like he's actually interested in peace. Of course, we know President Zelensky has been insisting that Vladimir Putin isn't interested in peace and that really he just wants to occupy all of Ukraine. But President Trump and White House officials say that while the president's talked to Vladimir Putin on the phone a number of times, he really needed a face-to-face meeting to assess whether or not he's serious about ending the war in Ukraine or whether he just wants to continue on. So the expectations here are low, and it's also interesting that the president says if things do go well, that he wants to have a meeting almost immediately. So the big question, of course, could be, could this summit be extended by another day, or could there be another summit with all three leaders next week? Ryan?
And we also heard the president raise the possibility of what he called severe consequences on Russia. Do we have any idea what that could include? Is this just these secondary sanctions that he was threatened last month, but he's never actually imposed?
Well, we know that the president, when he has been angry at Vladimir Putin, when he's lashed out online, he's talked about the issue of sanctions. We also know that European leaders on their call with President Trump and President Zelensky today, that they talked about the fact that sanctions should be put on Russia if they do not make progress toward peace. That being said, the president today did not want to get into details on what those consequences should be, but it is telling that he said there would be severe consequences. It's also interesting because right now we have this tone from President Trump. At first, he was very angry at Vladimir Putin, saying he had gone crazy, that he has conversations with President Trump and then goes out and murders people, saying he was very confused by Vladimir Putin's decision-making and behavior. Then he said, well, actually, I think Vladimir Putin is interested in peace. So now, of course, we have this summit happening in Alaska. I was in Helsinki last time there was a summit between President Trump and President Putin, and President Trump took a sort of demure attitude in face-to-face when he was having that, of course, now famous press conference where he was standing alongside him. He also was conciliatory, saying that he believed Vladimir Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies when they were talking about Russian interference in the 2016 election. So I'm going to be very interested to see what tone and sort of whether or not he has that conciliatory tone again with Vladimir Putin, or whether or not he's more critical and stands up for himself a bit more. Ryan?
Okay, Yamiche, thank you for that. Let's bring Andrea into the conversation now. Actually, Yamiche, we're going to bring Andrea into the conversation now. And so, Andrea, yesterday, President Zelensky said that Russia is not preparing for an end to the war, which seems a little different than President Trump, who seems to think there's a possibility that the end is imminent. He actually said they're preparing for a new offensive. Is President Putin heading into this meeting in Alaska in good faith? What should we expect?
Hardly. Exactly the opposite. He has been escalating his attacks every day on Ukraine in the days leading up to this summit. He is not showing any interest in a ceasefire. So it's hard to imagine that he's going to agree to a ceasefire. And President Trump today, again, as Yamiche was just saying, was referring to the 2016 Russia investigation, of course, his impeachment, and the whole issue that soured him, and where he, in Helsinki, when I was covering it, had a one-on-one summit without an American note-taker, came out and, again, validated Putin's view that there was no Russian hoax, no Russian hacking, and undercut his own intelligence agencies, the U.S. intelligence agencies. So he repeated that verbatim today. That really seems to be stuck in his mind, and talked about Pam Bondi, who was in the room at the Kennedy Center, and about the investigation of Adam Schiff. He has not let go of that.
And President Trump said today there could be a second meeting, perhaps. This one might involve both Putin and Zelensky. Is that realistic, given where things are now?
Putin has never agreed to sit down with Zelensky in good faith. So if he were to, that would be a big deal. But the fact is, the real risk for Zelensky, despite how well the meetings apparently went in these, these Zoom meetings today with the Europeans, with Zelensky, with Trump, Rubio and Vance were also part of it. The real risk is that Donald Trump will agree to something one-on-one with Vladimir Putin, or there won't be a note-taker again, and we won't know what, Putin claims he agreed to. And Zelensky will be faced with a fait accompli, and will be put on defensive with concessions that he can't accept.
Right. And you know that this better than anyone, that the optics of everything are so important in a meeting like this. Talk to me about what it says that there's a leader-level meeting on a U.S. military base, especially given the fact that Putin has not been in the United States in more than 10 years. What should we take from that? What's the symbolism there?
And the last time it was at the United Nations, so it was technically not a U.S. visit. It was a visit to New York as a foreign leader, which is considered, diplomatic territory. Look, he's under indictment by the International Criminal Court under the UN. He can't go in most places in Europe without at least some fear of being arrested. He comes here. He's in Alaska, which Russia originally owned and then ceded to the U.S. in a notable, arrangement, a treaty. And he has every advantage of being seen, elevated to a leader on a par with the U.S. president.
Right. Let's bring Yamiche back into the conversation. And Yamiche, last week, President Trump raised the possibility of land swaps between Russia and Ukraine. We know Europe and Ukraine are very much opposed to that. Is that something that's still on the table heading into this summit on Friday?
It's a really good question, Ryan, because we know that President Zelensky has said that the Ukrainian constitution doesn't allow Ukraine to just give up sovereign territory to Russia. And we've also had NBC reporting talking to Ukrainian residents saying, look, they've been fighting this war for 3 years. They don't want to just give up land and territory to Russia. That being said, the president has not backed away from that. He said very clearly that he believes some sort of territory swapping will have to happen. It'll be interesting to see what happens. We know that Russia has sort of moved their sort of goalposts, at least publicly. At one point, they wanted a whole region. Now they're saying maybe they can just do a fourth of that region. Still, though, we have to remind folks that this is all sovereign Ukrainian territory. So it's a big question of what actually could be worked out here, Ryan.
Okay, Yamiche, thank you for that. And one more to you, Andrea. The German chancellor laid out what he called 5 principles for peace. He said that European leaders and President Zelensky shared that with President Trump. It included Ukraine having a seat at the negotiating table, no recognition of territory seized by Russia, and security guarantees for Ukraine. Is there a peace deal to end the war feasible if this is the framework that they're working off of?
Well, that is the framework that the Europeans and Ukraine want, but that is not at all what President Putin has bought into, and so far not President Trump either. And the fact that Ukraine is not at the table, Europe is cut out of this, it's taking place in Alaska, violates the first 2 of those principles.
Yes, all right. Andrea Mitchell, thank you for that. We
You bet.
appreciate it. And we're going to talk more about this now with Richard Haass, the President Emeritus at the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard, thanks for joining me. Just first off, give me your expectations of the Trump-Putin summit. Who is this meeting more important for, President Trump or for President Putin?
Well, it's important to them both for different reasons. Putin wants to use the meeting, ideally from his point of view, to bring about a one-sided arrangement in his favor, which is then presented to President Zelensky, who rejects it, and then it leads to a breakdown in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. That would be the ideal result for Putin. I think his fallback result is simply that things go nowhere, but he's not blamed for it. The president's put himself in the odd position of wanting progress, wanting to be the peacemaker. I think the good news is that in the last 24 hours, we're seeing the White House in some ways escape from the trap they began to set for themselves. They're dialing down the expectations, talking about this being a listening exercise, a preliminary meeting, what have you. And I think that's good because, quite honestly, the only kind of big result would be one in Russia's favor, not ours and not Ukraine's.
Do you think they made a mistake by not having any sort of preconditions, something along the lines of requiring a Zelensky-Putin meeting first, or should you take advantage of an opportunity to sit down with the Russian leader when you have it?
I would have first had a meeting with President Zelensky. My own view is you always meet with your friends and allies before you meet with your adversaries. I also perhaps would have gotten some conditions from Vladimir Putin, basically saying, we're willing to meet, but what are you prepared to put on the table? And for example, there's been zero evidence that Russia has pulled back its attacks on Ukraine, including civilian targets. Why not have asked for a few weeks of a pause in those? So I think the idea that we agreed to an unconditional meeting was, shall I say, overly generous.
And there will be a portion of this summit in which President Putin and President Trump are going to meet one-on-one with nobody else in the room. Do you have any concerns about that?
Look, absolutely, for 2 reasons. I never like meetings between heads of government without note-takers in the room. I was the note-taker many times when I worked, say, with President Bush 41. And it's important because leaders often talk past one another. They hear what they want to hear. They misunderstand. English is not necessarily the first language for certain people, and so what translations can get off. So I'm never comfortable with that. Plus, in this, let's just be blunt about it. For Vladimir Putin, this is the issue he dreams about, thinks about, sleeps about, eats about, talks about all the time, 24/7. For Donald Trump, this is one of 100 issues. Vladimir Putin simply knows this incomparably better than Donald Trump. That's not a cheap shot at our president. That's simply a fact of life. So the idea that he would be doing this without his experts in the room, to the extent we still have experts in our government, I think that's a tactical error.
I think it's fair to say President Trump's, at least public posture when it comes to Vladimir Putin has changed quite a bit since he won re-election in January. Or I should say since he was inaugurated in January. He's now saying there will be severe consequences if Putin doesn't agree to stop the war after their meeting on Friday. But we've also seen Trump make these threats and then he walks them back. Is he taking Putin, is Putin, I should say, taking that threat seriously, especially given the fact that Trump has changed his rhetoric as it relates to the Russian leader?
I would think not, and let's be blunt about it. If the consequences of secondary sanctions, those are hardly severe. Just the other day, the vice president said the United States wasn't going to support the Ukrainian war effort. That would be a severe consequence if we were to basically tell the Russians, We are going to give open-ended military and intelligence support for Ukraine as long as it needs it, as much as it needs, so Russia cannot advance on the battlefield and so Russia feels the costs of the war. That would be a severe consequence for Mr. Putin. I see zero evidence that the Trump administration is prepared to put that forward, which is too bad. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the best and I would think only way to get the ceasefire that President Trump is trying to bring about.
Finally, this is going to happen on a U.S. military base. Usually you have weeks of planning that goes into these to meetings like this. Do you have any security concerns about having a meeting at a military installation like this?
No, I have zero security concerns. I have, shall we say, a good many political and diplomatic concerns for the reason you suggest. This has not been sufficiently prepared or structured. But security concerns, absolutely not.
Okay, Richard Haass, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.